The cruelest rooms are never the loudest. They are the ones where kindness quietly disappears. I heard the laughter before I understood that it was meant for me. It floated through the elegant ballroom like soft music, mixing with the gentle melody of a string quartet, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the delicate fragrance of fresh white roses arranged beneath towering chandeliers. Everything around me looked beautiful. Everything inside me suddenly felt cold. I sat perfectly still beneath the warm golden lights while hundreds of guests continued smiling as though nothing unusual was happening. Expensive evening gowns shimmered beneath the polished reflections of the marble floor. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed charitable donations and business partnerships without ever noticing how quickly dignity could disappear inside a room full of successful people. I wrapped my fingers around the edge of my chair so tightly that the diamond on my wedding ring pressed into my skin. It reminded me to breathe. Across the room, someone whispered my name. Another person quietly laughed. I lifted my eyes toward the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights stretched across the city beneath a deep blue evening sky, each one shining with complete indifference to what was unfolding inside this luxury hotel. I wished, just for a second, that Adrian were standing beside me. He was still flying home from Chicago after a week of meetings, completely unaware that the woman he kissed goodbye only days earlier was about to become the center of a memory neither of us would ever forget. The low mechanical hum reached my ears a moment later. Calm, steady, almost ordinary. That ordinary sound somehow felt heavier than every whisper surrounding me. A few strands of my chestnut hair drifted silently onto the polished floor. Someone raised a phone. Another guest looked away. Several women standing nearby exchanged satisfied smiles as though they had finally proven something important about themselves. I searched the faces surrounding me, hoping one person might quietly step forward and remind the room what compassion looked like. No one moved. Silence became another guest at the gala. It sat comfortably beside every polished table without asking permission. I closed my eyes for one slow breath and remembered the afternoon Adrian first walked into the small coffee shop where I worked during graduate school. Newspapers described him as intimidating. Television called him one of the most influential businessmen in New York. Yet the first thing he ever said to me was, "Thank you for remembering exactly how I take my coffee." He noticed ordinary things. He respected ordinary people. That memory settled gently inside my heart, while another lock of hair slipped toward the marble floor. I refused to cry, not because I was fearless, but because I suddenly realized tears would only become another performance for people who had already forgotten the meaning of kindness. I slowly straightened my back, lifted my chin, and looked directly at my own reflection in the dark glass beyond the ballroom. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Her appearance had changed in only a few painful moments, but her blue eyes still carried the same quiet determination. The laughter around me gradually faded into uncertain whispers. They expected humiliation to break me. Instead, my silence unsettled them more than any words ever could. Somewhere above the clouds, Adrian's plane continued descending toward New York. He had no idea that before another sunrise he would ask a single question that would quietly change every life connected to this room. The silence inside our home frightened me more than the laughter ever had. Adrian's flight landed just after sunrise, and by the time the black sedan rolled through the front gates, a gentle rain had begun falling over Manhattan. Tiny drops tapped softly against the tall windows while gray clouds wrapped the skyline in a quiet mist. Usually, I waited by the front door whenever he returned from a business trip. This morning I stayed upstairs, sitting beside our bedroom window with an untouched cup of tea growing colder between my hands. I heard the front door open. I heard familiar footsteps crossing the marble floor below. Then everything became still. Even the house seemed to stop breathing. Adrian greeted the staff with his usual warmth, but no one answered with their normal smiles. He noticed immediately. "Where is Claire?" he asked calmly. No one spoke. Vincent, the head of security, finally stepped forward. "She is upstairs, sir." Adrian studied every face in the entrance hall. Years of leading powerful companies had taught him that silence always carried information. "What happened?" he asked. Vincent lowered his eyes. "Mrs. Moretti asked everyone to wait until you came home." Adrian nodded once. He did not ask another question. He climbed the staircase slowly, one step at a time, his polished shoes echoing softly through the quiet house. When he reached our bedroom, the door stood slightly open. Warm morning light filled the room, turning everything peaceful except for the woman standing before the mirror. I saw his reflection before I found the courage to turn around. His suitcase slipped gently from his hand onto the floor. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. His green eyes rested on my closely cropped chestnut hair, then slowly lifted to meet my blue eyes. There was no shock on his face, no anger, no pity, only heartbreak wrapped inside impossible composure. "You are home," I whispered, forcing a smile that disappeared almost immediately. Adrian crossed the room without hesitation. He stopped only inches away and carefully rested his hand against the side of my head, as though I were the most precious thing he had ever touched. I had held back every tear inside that ballroom because I refused to give strangers the satisfaction of seeing me break. The moment his hand reached mine, every wall I had built quietly collapsed. Tears rolled down my face before I could stop them. Adrian gently pulled me into his embrace and held me without saying a single word. The rain continued tapping against the windows while my breathing slowly steadied. After a long silence, he stepped back just enough to look at me again. "Nothing they did changed who you are," he said softly. "The woman I married is still standing in front of me." I searched his face, trying to find even the smallest trace of anger. Instead, I found love, quiet and unwavering. "I did not want you to come home to this," I admitted. He gently brushed a tear from my cheek. "Claire, I would rather come home to the truth than live comfortably with a lie." He took both of my hands and held them firmly but gently. His voice became almost a whisper. "There is only one thing I need to know." I looked into his eyes. "How many people were there?" For a long moment I could not answer. I looked down at our hands instead, tracing the familiar lines across Adrian's fingers while the rain continued sliding quietly down the bedroom windows. Every name I carried inside my memory felt heavier than the last. I had spent the entire night convincing myself that silence would somehow protect everyone from even more pain. Adrian never rushed me. He simply waited, his calm presence giving me the courage to speak. 12, I whispered at last. His expression never changed. "Tell me every name." I shook my head almost immediately. "If I do, you will try to fix this." A faint, almost invisible smile touched his face. "No, Claire, I will understand it." I searched his eyes, hoping to find anger because anger would have been easier to recognize than the quiet determination I saw instead. "You always believe people deserve the truth," he continued gently. "Do not take that away from me now." I slowly walked toward the bedroom window, overlooking the rain-soaked streets below. Yellow taxis moved through the gray morning while pedestrians hurried beneath black umbrellas. The city looked exactly the same as it had the day before, yet everything inside my world had changed. I began speaking one name after another. Some belonged to women who laughed openly. Others belonged to people who stood silently, choosing comfort over compassion. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small leather notebook he usually carried to important meetings. Without interrupting me once, he carefully wrote every name in neat handwriting. When I finally whispered the 12th and final name, he closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. "Is that everyone?" he asked softly. I nodded. "As far as I know." He stepped closer and gently kissed my forehead. "Thank you." I caught his sleeve before he could leave the room. "Promise me something." He stopped immediately. "Do not let this change who you are." Adrian looked at me with quiet warmth. "Claire, I have spent my entire life learning that real strength is measured by restraint. I will remember that." Less than an hour later, he entered the private operations office beneath his Manhattan headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling monitors illuminated the otherwise quiet room, while Vincent waited beside the central workstation, holding several folders. "The hotel cooperated after an internal review," Vincent explained. "They released the archived security recordings from every public area involved." Adrian nodded once and took his seat. The first recording showed Claire arriving with her usual gentle smile, thanking volunteers and greeting elderly donors before the gala began. The second recording revealed a very different scene. Nearly 40 minutes before Claire entered the private lounge, several women gathered together inside the room. They reviewed guest lists, exchanged messages, pointed toward Claire's photograph printed inside the event program, and quietly coordinated their movements. Adrian leaned slightly forward without speaking. Every timestamp matched perfectly. Every conversation confirmed that nothing had happened by chance. Another camera angle showed additional guests watching without intervening. The silence surrounding the event had been planned almost as carefully as the humiliation itself. When the final recording ended, Vincent quietly asked, "What are your instructions, sir?" Adrian stood, buttoned his jacket with calm precision, and looked once more at the frozen image displayed across the largest monitor. "Do not contact any of them," he replied. "People rarely recognize the value of their reputation until the truth begins introducing itself." The city looked exactly the same, but quiet changes had already begun. Morning sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan, while commuters hurried toward office buildings carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that 12 carefully chosen decisions were about to reshape 12 carefully protected reputations. Adrian never called anyone. He never issued threats. He never demanded loyalty. Instead, he returned to work exactly as he always had, attending board meetings, reviewing investment proposals, and honoring every appointment already on his calendar. The only difference was that truth had quietly entered conversations where appearances once spoke the loudest. I spent my mornings at the neighborhood reading center, trying to lose myself in children's stories instead of my own. Their laughter sounded nothing like the laughter inside that ballroom. It carried innocence instead of cruelty. A little boy proudly showed me a drawing of a lighthouse standing beside the ocean. "It helps people find their way home," he explained with a smile. I thanked him and pinned the picture to the classroom wall, wondering whether people could also become lighthouses for one another after surviving their darkest storms. Meanwhile, subtle changes continued unfolding across the city. Over the following 2 weeks, one woman who had openly encouraged the humiliation received notice that her nomination to a prestigious charitable board had been suspended, while an independent ethics committee completed a routine review. Another learned that a luxury fashion brand had selected a different ambassador after executives reconsidered the values they wished their organization to represent. A third quietly lost 2 longtime donors who informed her that they preferred supporting foundations whose leadership reflected dignity and respect. Every decision arrived through official letters, professional meetings, or carefully worded phone calls. No accusations were made. No public campaign appeared. The truth simply reached people responsible for making important decisions, and those people acted according to their own standards. One evening I returned home carrying another stack of children's books beneath my arm. Adrian stood on the balcony overlooking the skyline, the fading sunset painting shades of gold across the Hudson River. He turned when he heard the door open and smiled with the same quiet warmth that had carried me through every difficult day since he came home. I walked beside him and rested my hands against the cool stone railing. "People keep talking," I said softly. "They are trying to understand why everything changed." Adrian looked toward the city instead of answering immediately. "Most people assume influence creates consequences," he replied. "Very few realize that character creates influence." I studied his face carefully. "Did you ask anyone to punish them?" He slowly shook his head. "No. I asked people to look at the truth before making their next decision. Everything that happened afterward belonged to them." His answer settled gently inside my heart. It sounded exactly like the man who had once thanked a college student for remembering how he liked his coffee. Power had never changed him. It had only given him more opportunities to protect what he believed was right. As darkness slowly covered the skyline, my phone vibrated quietly inside my purse. An elegant ivory envelope had just been delivered to our front gate by private courier. The return address belonged to the very same charity foundation where everything had begun. I stared at Adrian before opening it, somehow already knowing that the next chapter of our story would lead us back to the one place I had sworn I would never enter again. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have. I held it in both hands while the evening breeze drifted across the balcony, carrying the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic below. Adrian waited beside me without asking what I would do. He had never forced my decisions. He simply made sure I always had the freedom to make them. I slowly broke the dark blue wax seal and unfolded the invitation inside. The charity foundation requested the honor of our presence at a special gala celebrating a renewed commitment to dignity, community leadership, and educational outreach. The location was impossible to ignore. The same ballroom, the same hotel, the same crystal chandeliers that had watched kindness disappear only weeks before. I quietly folded the invitation and stared toward the skyline. I cannot go back there, I admitted. Adrian rested one hand gently against the balcony railing beside mine. You do not have to. I looked at him in surprise. Then why was this delivered to us? He smiled softly. Because someone believes you belong there. I lowered my eyes. I am afraid the moment I walk through those doors, I will remember everything. Adrian turned toward me completely. Claire, memories do not become smaller because we avoid them. Sometimes they become smaller because we survive walking through them again. His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. 2 nights later, I stood inside our bedroom, wearing a simple navy evening gown almost identical to the one I had worn before. My naturally growing chestnut hair framed my face differently now, shorter but filled with quiet confidence I had not recognized until this moment. I studied my reflection in the mirror while adjusting a small pair of pearl earrings my grandmother once gave me. Adrian entered wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He stopped at the doorway and smiled with unmistakable warmth. You look beautiful. I laughed softly. People are going to stare. He crossed the room and gently offered his hand. Let them stare at your courage. The drive through Manhattan felt strangely peaceful. City lights reflected across rain-washed streets while elegant restaurants filled with evening guests passed quietly beyond the windows. When our car arrived beneath the grand entrance of the hotel, photographers gathered near the red carpet documenting the arrivals of donors and foundation members. Camera flashes illuminated the entrance as Adrian stepped out first before offering me his hand. I hesitated for only a heartbeat before accepting it. Together we walked toward the entrance. Conversation slowed almost immediately. Several familiar faces recognized me at once. The whispers I expected never came. Instead, I saw lowered eyes, hesitant expressions, and uncomfortable silence. The ballroom looked exactly as I remembered. White roses decorated every table. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. The Manhattan skyline stretched beyond towering windows beneath a clear autumn night. Yet the atmosphere had completely changed. Adrian guided me calmly to our seats near the front of the room. The foundation. President welcomed every guest before announcing that the evening would begin with a presentation honoring integrity, leadership, and compassion. As the house lights slowly dimmed, a massive projection screen descended behind the stage. Adrian quietly reached beneath the table and gently intertwined his fingers with mine. Then the first image appeared across the screen, and every voice inside the ballroom disappeared. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that even the soft hum of the projection system seemed unusually loud. No dramatic soundtrack accompanied the presentation. No narrator explained what the audience was about to witness. The truth needed neither performance nor persuasion. The first recording showed guests arriving beneath sparkling chandeliers, greeting one another with polished smiles, while volunteers welcomed everyone through the front entrance. Familiar faces filled the enormous screen, each moving through the elegant hotel exactly as they remembered. Then the next recording appeared. A timestamp glowed quietly in the corner while the camera shifted toward the private lounge hidden behind the ballroom. Several women entered the room nearly 40 minutes before I did. They exchanged knowing glances, checked the event schedule, studied the printed guest list, and repeatedly pointed toward my photograph inside the evening program. Every movement unfolded naturally, captured by the hotel's own security cameras without interruption or exaggeration. Around me, I heard small gasps spreading through the audience. Crystal glasses remained untouched upon white linen tablecloths. Nobody whispered. Nobody searched for excuses. Every guest understood they were watching ordinary choices become undeniable evidence. Adrian continued holding my hand beneath the table with the same quiet steadiness that had carried me through every difficult morning since he returned home. His calm never demanded attention, yet somehow it became the strongest presence in the entire room. The final recording faded away, replaced by a simple white sentence against a dark background. Character is revealed most clearly when kindness becomes inconvenient. The lights slowly brightened across the ballroom. Adrian rose from his chair and walked toward the stage without hesitation. His measured footsteps echoed gently across the polished marble floor until he reached the podium. He looked across the audience for several long seconds before speaking. "Thank you for joining us this evening." His voice remained respectful, steady, and remarkably calm. Nothing shown tonight was created to shame anyone. Every image came from the hotel's archived security system after its internal review. The purpose of this presentation is not humiliation. It is honesty. No one interrupted. No one looked away from him. My wife accepted an invitation to support a charitable cause because she believed generosity should always stand above pride. She entered this building with respect for every person she met. What happened afterward did not diminish her dignity. It challenged ours. His words settled gently across the room. Over the past several weeks, many organizations have reviewed their own standards, partnerships, and leadership decisions. Those choices were made independently by people who concluded that integrity deserves the same attention as achievement. Reputation is built one decision at a time, and so is trust. Adrian stepped away from the podium without waiting for applause. For another long moment, the ballroom remained perfectly still. Then an elderly woman seated near the front slowly stood and began clapping with quiet conviction. One by one, other guests rose beside her until the entire ballroom filled with respectful applause that sounded nothing like celebration. It sounded like recognition. Adrian returned to my side, took his seat, and gently squeezed my hand. I looked at him through grateful tears that no longer carried shame. He smiled softly and whispered, "Nobody can change yesterday, Claire. But together we can decide what tomorrow remembers." At that moment, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving anyone wrong. It was discovering that the part of me they tried to diminish had quietly become stronger than ever before. The applause gradually faded until only quiet conversations remained, softer than before, more thoughtful than before. For the first time since that painful afternoon, people were no longer looking at me with curiosity. They were looking inward, measuring their own choices against the truth they had just witnessed. An elderly gentleman from the foundation board approached our table first. His silver hair reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers as he slowly removed his glasses and held them in both hands. "Mrs. Moretti," he said with a voice filled with sincere regret, "I was in this room that day. I convinced myself that remaining silent was the respectful thing to do. Tonight, I finally understand that silence protected the wrong people." I smiled gently and thanked him. There was no anger left inside me for someone who had found the courage to admit his mistake. One by one, other guests quietly stepped forward. Some apologized with steady voices. Others struggled through trembling words. A few simply lowered their heads because they could not yet find the language their conscience demanded. Every apology felt different, but together they transformed the atmosphere of the ballroom into something I never expected. It no longer felt like the place where I had lost part of myself. It felt like the place where honesty had finally arrived. Near the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, I noticed Victoria Langford standing completely alone. Only weeks earlier, she had been surrounded by admirers, donors, and influential friends. Tonight, an empty circle surrounded her instead. She remained motionless for several moments before slowly walking toward our table. Her elegant evening gown and perfect appearance could no longer hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She stopped a respectful distance away and looked directly at me instead of Adrian. "Claire," she said quietly, "I believed making someone else feel small would make me appear important. I have spent every day since then discovering how wrong I was." Her voice grew softer. "Nothing I say can erase what happened, but I cannot continue pretending I deserve the positions I hold without accepting responsibility for how I used them." She carefully placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Tomorrow morning I will submit my resignation from every charitable board where I currently serve. I have also instructed my attorneys to establish an educational scholarship for women rebuilding their confidence after public hardship. It will never erase the past, but I hope it can improve someone else's future." Adrian remained completely silent. He never reached for the envelope. He never interrupted. This moment belonged entirely to me. I looked at the envelope before gently sliding it back toward Victoria. "Do not build something because you feel guilty," I said softly. "Build it because you finally understand why kindness matters." Tears filled her eyes as she slowly nodded. "I do." She thanked me quietly before turning away, leaving the ballroom without looking back. Adrian watched the doors close before smiling at me with unmistakable pride. "You could have chosen bitterness," he said. I rested my hand inside his and smiled through grateful tears. Bitterness would have allowed them to keep part of my future. I would rather keep all of it for myself. He gently squeezed my hand. Around us, the orchestra began playing again. Conversations slowly returned, and the same ballroom that had once echoed with thoughtless laughter now carried something entirely different. It carried humility, accountability, and hope. Looking around the room one final time, I realized that dignity had never been something another person could remove from me. It had only been waiting for me to believe in it again. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I had almost forgotten was possible. Manhattan continued racing through its endless mornings and glittering evenings, but inside me something had finally become quiet. Every Wednesday, I returned to the neighborhood reading center carrying a canvas bag filled with books and lesson plans, and every Wednesday the children greeted me exactly the same way they always had. They never stared at my short chestnut hair. They never asked uncomfortable questions. They simply ran toward me with bright smiles, eager to tell me about new words they had learned and stories they wanted to read together. Their innocence reminded me that kindness was never something people were born without. It was something adults sometimes chose to forget. One sunny afternoon, a little girl carefully placed a handmade paper crown on my head after finishing her favorite fairy tale. She stepped back, folded her hands proudly, and smiled. "Now you look like the queen," she said. I laughed softly. "Why?" She shrugged with the effortless wisdom only children seem to possess. "Because queens help people feel safe." I felt tears gathering unexpectedly, but this time they carried gratitude instead of pain. That simple sentence healed something no apology ever could. Later that evening, Adrian arrived at the reading center instead of sending a driver. He leaned casually against the black sedan waiting outside, while the last families slowly walked toward the parking lot beneath golden sunlight. When he saw the paper crown still resting playfully on my head, he smiled with genuine amusement. "I see someone has been promoted." I laughed and removed the crown carefully before placing it inside my bag. "Apparently, I make people feel safe." Adrian opened the passenger door for me before answering. "That sounds exactly right." We drove through the city without rushing anywhere. Spring flowers brightened the sidewalks while street musicians performed beneath subway entrances and outdoor cafes filled with conversations drifting into the evening air. For the first time in months, we spoke almost entirely about ordinary things. A new reading program, a bakery that had finally reopened after renovations, a family of ducks we had seen crossing a quiet street near Central Park. Ordinary conversations suddenly felt extraordinary because our lives were no longer controlled by one painful afternoon. After dinner, we stepped onto the balcony overlooking the glowing skyline. Warm air carried the distant sounds of ferries moving across the Hudson River, while thousands of lights reflected against the glass towers surrounding us. I rested both hands on the stone railing before quietly asking the question I had carried inside me since everything happened. "Did you ever want revenge?" Adrian remained silent for several moments. His answer finally came with the same calm honesty that had always made me trust him. "For one moment, yes." He looked toward the city before continuing. "Then I remembered something you taught me long before this happened. Justice protects the future. Revenge only revisits the past." I turned toward him, surprised that he remembered words I had spoken years earlier during an ordinary conversation neither of us thought important at the time. He reached for my hand and smiled gently. "You have always made me a better man than I could have become alone." I rested my head lightly against his shoulder while the city stretched endlessly before us. In that quiet moment, I finally understood that healing was never about forgetting what happened. Healing was waking up one day and realizing the memory no longer decided who I would become, because the strongest part of my story had never been the day I was hurt. It was the day I chose not to let hurt become my identity. 1 year later, I found myself standing beneath the very same crystal chandeliers where I once believed my life had fallen apart. This time the ballroom looked different, not because the walls had changed, but because the people inside had. Families, teachers, volunteers, and community leaders filled the room with genuine laughter that carried warmth instead of judgment. Fresh white roses decorated every table, children's artwork lined the entrance hall, and scholarship recipients proudly greeted guests with hopeful smiles. My chestnut hair had grown to rest softly against my shoulders, but I rarely thought about it anymore. I had spent so many months believing that healing would arrive when everything looked the way it once had. Instead, healing arrived the day I stopped measuring my worth by what other people could see. Adrian stood beside me wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, quietly greeting donors and volunteers with the same calm respect he offered everyone, whether they managed a global company or simply held the door for someone else. Watching him move through the room reminded me of the first thing I had ever admired about him. It had never been influence. It had been kindness. As the evening continued, the foundation president stepped onto the stage and invited me to say a few words before announcing the year's new educational scholarships. I had not prepared a speech. I simply walked to the podium, looked across the ballroom, and smiled. The room became wonderfully quiet. A year ago, I began softly. I believed losing part of my appearance meant losing part of myself. I was wrong. I paused as gentle sunlight from the fading evening filtered through the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. The people who truly loved me never saw me differently. The people who judged me taught me something even more valuable. They reminded me that dignity cannot be taken away unless we surrender it ourselves. I looked toward Adrian, who answered with the same gentle smile that had carried me through every difficult chapter. Kindness is often mistaken for weakness until the day someone discovers it takes far more courage than cruelty ever will. If my story has any meaning, I hope it reminds every person here that compassion is never wasted, silence always has consequences, and every ordinary act of respect has the power to change someone else's future. The ballroom filled with quiet applause before children rushed onto the stage to celebrate the scholarship recipients. One little girl wearing a bright blue dress walked toward me carrying another handmade paper crown, carefully placing it on my head with both hands before hugging me tightly. Everyone laughed softly, but this time the laughter sounded beautiful. Adrian joined us a moment later and gently adjusted the tiny paper crown so it rested comfortably. "It suits you," he whispered. I smiled through grateful tears and looked around the room one final time. The same city still shimmered beyond the glass. The same ballroom still stood beneath sparkling chandeliers. Even many of the same faces remained. Yet everything had changed because love had proven stronger than humiliation. Truth had outlasted cruelty, and forgiveness had protected my future without erasing my past. Walking out into the cool Manhattan evening with Adrian's hand in mine, I finally understood that courage is never the absence of pain. Courage is choosing to remain kind after pain has every reason to convince you otherwise, and that quiet choice became the greatest victory of my entire life.